shapes become forms. Alright, we have a zombie pair. I'm going to show you some various aspects about light and shadow. So to start with, let's create a light source. So the first thing though, is we need to establish our midtones. Another way to look at midtones, you could call them, if this was color, local color, being that a pair is yellow, so the local color would be yellow, or would say the local value, so we expect a certain value for that yellow to be. Before I get started creating my various shadows and such, let's take a look at this form. If we were to take a slice out of this pair here, popping that whole top off, you would see an ellipse like this, kind of like a cup of coffee. Now we wouldn't see the back one necessarily, but certainly extra lines don't matter, and if you need to draw that back one to make sure you get the proper ellipse, definitely do so. There's basically our curve, and we want to create a local value. This is where having something a little bit lighter value-wise in graphite can be very helpful. I would probably start with a 2H and using the natural curve of my hand, filling in on the surface. Now his mouth is very different, so we don't really want to start filling in with the same curve. I forgot to write this down, but what we're doing here is cross contour shading. So I'll probably speed this up in the video. This is going to take a minute. I do want to say, so this ellipse that we started with, the slice out of pair, those are establishing the curves, angles that we should be working at. Now because the bottom of the pair is much rounder, we're probably going to take on even more of an angle down low. But if you can't do full lines, or if it's just more convenient, as long as you're doing the correct angle, do it in sections. That's perfectly fine. I'll create a whole video, of course, about cross contour shading, but right now, just so you know, that is what I'm doing here. And don't be afraid to rotate your drawing so it's easier to work. Again, avoid using your fingers for blending if you can. But now that I've got a bunch of graphite in place, I'm going to Again, follow the contour. If you need to follow down along the edges, just to get it to fill in properly, that's fine. But then remember to pull it back into the form following the contour. We can still see the lines where that ellipse was, not a big deal. We'll just keep working this thing. Most of that will either go away, or we could have fun with it and actually just kind of put it in there, and maybe he was stitched together at one point. So again, we've created our midtones. They're not lit up by the light source, they're not in shadow, they're just what we expect our value to be, our local value. I'm going to do this for now. I'm not sure what value that fork will be, but just so you can kind of see various aspects a little better. So that's kind of just the everywhere value. All right, so the next thing, there is an aspect of light called ambient light. And that's like when you're in a room and there's only a window, no lights on, and there's enough light bouncing around that room that you can see clearly the objects that are facing away from the window. This is important because our next idea is ambient occlusion. And those are areas that bouncing light can't get to. And the first thing we want to do is start looking for those areas. So for example, the inside of his mouth is going to be a little darker. There's not going to be a bunch of light bouncing around inside. It's like a little mini cave, right? Now this is a really good place to break out your blending stump. Your thumb's not really going to fit in there. Thumb using a paper towel. Of course, try not to use your fingers and such directly. I shouldn't even be resting my hand, but for the sake of this tutorial, I just want to be able to you guys to see everything I'm doing. Even in your blending, always try to follow the contours. In this case, the back of his mouth, if the front of him was curving downward slightly, the back of the inside of his mouth is probably curving the opposite direction. All right, let's look for some more areas of ambient occlusion. Probably the underside of this kind of torn up lip, at the root of that tooth, under that tongue, and at the root of these teeth. Those are areas that light is not getting to easily. Maybe underneath these stitches. And if this is a slice out of him, there might be a gap there. And that gap's probably not perfect, so we could make that kind of jagged. Again, this is ambient occlusion. We're looking for areas where light probably really doesn't get to it. Under that eyelid, down in this little divot where his stem is. Definitely between fingers. So ambient occlusion is really just thinking about where can't the light get to much at all. Before we go any further, his gums and his tongue are probably going to be a little bit darker than his skin, right? Oh, let's get some ambient occlusion down into these gaps. That is a great place to use your blending stump again. You're really shaping the root of those teeth, you're shaping the gums. Alright, so let's move on to the form shadows. So if the light source is coming mostly at an angle here, it's going to light up most of this side of him. So about here and to the left, we're going to be creating a form shadow. So he is the form, that's the three-dimensional shape. So shadows on the form are form shadows. I'm going to follow the contours of pear again, but this time in creating the form shadow that is right here and under, I'm going to simply make it a little bit darker. I am following the contour, but again, if you can't do it in full lines, break it up into shorter sections, but try to maintain the proper angles. Darkening my form shadows might mean I have to also darken some of that ambient occlusion, and that's fine. This is a little trickier alongside things like this arm. We'll get back to that in a moment. Although we are just going to go right over it. It is in shadow. It might have a little bit of light hitting some areas of it. So the fork being on the backside of the pear that is in shadow, the form shadow, that probably means that about here, here, those parts of the fork will also be in shadow. So that is the form shadow. And I am going to run along this edge just to make it a little more precise. But remember, once I'm done with that, I will also need to pull that out into the form so it matches up with the contours, right? I'm still considering contours. I smudged some of that shading beyond where it needed to be. So I'm just cleaning up a little bit. So instead of wiping all that stuff away by hand so that we don't smudge it again, that is where having some sort of brush to deal with the eraser shavings is really nice. So the opposite side of the form shadows will probably give us some highlights, depending on the light source. Maybe even a little bit of a highlight there on the side. The underside of these bites, these bite marks, might have a little bit of shading. That got a little too dark. That's alright. We can lighten it back up. So hopefully you can see my highlights decently. We wouldn't want highlights down below because that's not where the light is actually aimed. And we might get a little highlight across an eyebrow ridge, maybe a little highlight across the top of the eye. Could even potentially have a little bit of highlight here where this jagged lip is. So those little bright areas where the direct light is hitting are highlights. So I'm not really following contours on his eye because I want it to be kind of flat. He's a zombie. That eye should just be kind of weird and flat. So I'm just kind of doing a scribbly squiggle to fill that in. But with the light source where it is, I don't think I put my highlights in very good locations. So I'm just going to go right over them and create new ones. With that light source, I'm probably going to get a highlight about right there. Alright, let's give a little bit of value to these feet, even down low. As long as you don't press too hard, pretty much everything can be adjusted as needed. Well, now that we've done some of this, I do want to go back in and reestablish some of the ambient occlusion, just like we did for the legs, because I'm pretty sure there's going to be a dark edge right here that light's not going to get to very easily. These teeth are probably not white. And that tongue, because of the light source, we may have some lighter edged tops of those teeth. Alright, so Pear is standing on the ground. Back to the ambient occlusion one more time. We're going to take a look at something called Umbra. And that is an area where just light is not getting to it all, and probably on the underside of his feet would be one of those locations. So the really dark areas. You don't often see a lot of those, but underneath his feet definitely. And this little bit of drool is probably catching some light. Alright, we're almost done. What we don't have is a cast shadow. So considering where the light is coming from, it's going to come down like this, and on the ground we'll have kind of a pear-shaped cast shadow. And the surface of our ground is pretty flat, so we could just make that shadow nice and flat. And of course, as we work that out, we can see that puts even more of that leg and most of this leg and even more shadow. So that foot is outside the shadow, that foot is in the shadow. So this is a cast shadow. We are losing some of our dark edges again, so we're going to go back in, reinforce them. Oftentimes when you do a bunch of blending, whether with a paper towel or a rag, even your finger, you will kind of blend away your darker areas because you're taking that graphite and you're just taking it away. So we have cast shadow. There is a aspect of light called the Terminator. Sometimes it's the Terminator Line. And that is where you might, not always, but you might see a slightly darker sort of line right where that shadow starts. The form shadow. I don't really want to emphasize it too much on this because I feel it wouldn't really be seen. And finally, light that is hitting the surface he's standing on might bounce. It might hit the ground and come back up, and we might end up with some reflected light on the underside of our form. So it's never going to be as light as this local value area, the midtone. And it's certainly not going to be as light as the highlight, but it is slightly larger, slightly lighter than the form shadow around it. So that is the reflected, or sometimes called bounce light. And at any point you can come in here and add different values. You can adjust. Maybe those highlights are not standing out as much as I want them to. We do want to try to keep with the cross contour shading as much as possible, though sometimes we have to sort of get in there and we can't always follow the contours exactly. But again, as much as you possibly can, try to follow the contours. I want those highlights on his eye surface to stand out a little bit more. There's all kinds of adjustments we could keep making, but I think this video is probably long enough at this point. Let me get an arrow from this. Umbra. Darkest areas without light. So just keep in mind, with the ambient light, light is bouncing around all over the place. Ambient occlusion, again, is figuring out those areas where maybe light's not really getting to, inside of things, little crease areas. This looks a little too defined, like there's a weird corner on him. In that case, might go back and soften that up a little bit. Oh, last little thing here. I just realized I was sort of talking about reflected light and what's happening, that it bounces off the surface and back up, but it doesn't really point to anything. And the reflected light on the bottom of pear is right there. So that should be pointing up here. I just wanted to clarify that. I also spread some shading out into areas of pear just to give him a little bit more three-dimensionality. He was looking a little flat in places. Throughout this quarter, we're going to be using a particular type of shading method called cross contour shading. What that means is when we have a form, how we've defined the form is going to tell us how to create the shading lines, or we can use the shading lines to help show the contour of an object. And I'll give you a couple examples here. These are going to be very quick, rough sketches, but if we had a cup, for example, this ellipse that I have used to create the cup, that defines the contour. And so as you shade, you're going to want to follow the contour. Whoops, that went up a little too quick. This is where it's much easier to rotate your paper, because again, you've got that natural curve of your hand. We're going to ignore that one because either that's, if this is a glass and we can see through it, that's on the far back side. Otherwise it wouldn't be visible at all. In fact, better than ignoring it, let's just get rid of it for the moment. So ultimately we're creating contour lines. If there's a form shadow over here, we're filling in, but based on that ellipse that we use to create the form itself. Now sometimes you do need to go perpendicular to your cross contour lines to kind of fill in. Just be careful that you don't overdo it. You don't want to draw too much attention to the lines going the opposite direction. Try to pull them back into the object itself. And sometimes you're drawing objects that are large and it's hard to get that full curve. It's perfectly fine as long as you're matching the angle, right? You can do so in columns. So change the angle, bring it down, change the angle, bring it down, because ultimately you're going to blend with the contour also. And look at that, you can't even tell that separate columns were used to do the shading. Now again, this ellipse defines our contour. So always correct your shapes before you start shading. And if this is an open cup, right, we've got a handle or something, it's a coffee cup, we're going to see the back side interior. But now the curve that defines the back side curves upward instead of downward. And so you want to make it seem like those lines curve up and away from you. So now we've created the back side of the cup that curves away from us. So let's look at a box shape of some sort, or a box form. Again, these are not trying to be perfect right now, but if you have flat faces, you want your cross contour shading lines to show that. So straight lines as much as possible, going perpendicular to them. Won't matter as much because what you're doing is you're flattening out the whole surface when you go perpendicular to your original lines. Keep straight motions when you're doing the blending, and that will give you a nice flat surface. When you do a side like this, over here to the right, you'll have to decide, do you want to use vertical lines, which kind of makes it very similar to this side. You might want to use straight lines that match the angles of the side, right? The shape that created that side. Again, you can go counter to those lines to help fill in. But now it makes that side more distinguishable from this side. And the top's probably not as dark. You can choose either to go at an angle, which will tie it in slightly with this side, or you can go horizontal lines, which will tie it in slightly with the first side. Or again, both. When you're doing flat surfaces, going more than one direction is perfectly fine. When you're doing curved surfaces like this cup, try to limit yourself to the shading lines, the cross contour shading lines that will emphasize the curve of the surface. I'm just making this up out of my head, so hopefully it's not too bad of a banana. Often on bananas there's a face that's kind of flat. We're going to give it a little bit of a curve. What we're doing is we're telling the viewer that, hey, these cross contour shading lines are showing you what that surface is. Again, ultimately we would fill in a lot like we do on these two objects. But right now, just to show, there's a slight curve to that surface of the banana, right? When we hit this edge right here, we change direction entirely because the banana, the face is actually aimed a different direction. Hopefully that makes sense. Those might be a little too angled. But yeah, then we would again fill in. So instead of a shape defining the contour, we're now using the cross contour lines to define the form. We'll get a little bit along the sides to just help fill in. But again, we don't want to emphasize these lines. This is just for filler. We want to emphasize the lines that create that curve. And that's probably not a dark line right there. That actually probably is almost like a highlight. We'll go counter to our cross contour shading lines just as a way to define the edges a little bit better. But then we're also blending again with the contour. Alright, do you see how three-dimensional the cross contour shading lines are making the banana look? Let me clean up this edge really quick. This could even be a little darker as it curves under. Here I am using my fingers again, even though I shouldn't. A bad example. Keep in mind as you start working on your own still life objects, use your shading direction to emphasize the form.